Michael Gibson-Light from the University of Denver. Michael has done lots of super interesting work about prisons and prison labor in the very recent times, and it's attracting a lot of attention, deservedly so. But today, in connection with all of that, his topic is Consent of the Punished, a Gramscian revisit of a prison ethnography. And without further ado, Michael, welcome, over to you.
Wonderful. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. I see a lot of names I recognize on the grid, so thank you so much for taking time. As if the U.S. election period wasn't scary enough, it's also Halloween, so thank you for being here on this day when the veil between the worlds of the living and the deceased is at its thinnest. We're going to take the opportunity to commune with one such spirit, that of Antonio Gramsci. Let's see if I can get him to appear. Hey, there he is. Thank you, everybody. So as Richard said, I've done some work in recent years trying to better understand the prison labor system within the United States from various angles and perspectives, including ethnographically. I was asked to give a book talk on my book that came out a little over a year ago now. It's called Orange Collar Labor. And I decided to sort of do that, but instead to take the opportunity to maybe reinterpret or differently theorize some aspects of the text using a Gramscian lens, which is only slightly and maybe only implicitly present in the book, but I wanted to tease it out more explicitly. In part because this is something I'm doing in a new paper along with a co-author of mine who was hoping to be here but couldn't make it, Phil Goodman from the University of Toronto. So he and I essentially are revisiting ethnographic info and data from my book, as well as from his earlier ethnographic analyses of prison labor. So I'm going to talk about my half of that, which is my way of doing a sort of book talk. So thank you for that. So this is Gramsci. Many of you are probably quite familiar, or at least to different degrees familiar with his work. He's a Marxian sociologist, philosopher, political scientist, politician, etc., who was perhaps famously, infamously imprisoned under the regime of Benito Mussolini in 1926. He remained behind bars until his death in 1937. The prosecutor at Gramsci's trial said, for 20 years, we must stop this brain from functioning. Unfortunately, due to many health issues that Gramsci suffered through, he didn't make it 20 years. But fortunately, his brain did not stop functioning. And in fact, he was more productive than perhaps he had even been prior, producing one of what I consider, and I assume many of you will agree, to be one of the greatest pieces of Marxian social theorizing that we've been graced with, that what is now known as the prison notebooks. Among many, many other questions in these sprawling notebooks, he tries to address a question of his day, which was, how exactly does the ruling class maintain control, despite what had come to be sort of received knowledge in many Marxian circles that capitalism's end was imminent and the workers would naturally soon rise up to sort of overthrow the shackles of their oppression, and that hadn't happened. So Gramsci wanted to understand how and why this had not happened. And one of the sort of theoretical tools he offers us and that he continued to develop for us to answer this question is he advanced this notion of cultural hegemony, the idea of government with the consent of the governed, but with this consent organized so that the state does not have and request consent, he writes, but it also educates this consent via institutions serving ruling interests. So in other words, governments use a combination of coercion and ideology to educate obedience, as he put it, or I should say, as his translators into English put it, to generate consent and to maintain control. Importantly, he reiterates repeatedly throughout the text that coercion always underlies consent, but often outright force is often reserved, except maybe in moments of crisis or peculiar instances. Now, in this text, despite being written from within an Italian prison, he writes a little bit about the United States, where I'm speaking to you from, and he notes that there are special conditions here that change how this works. He says hegemony here, writing of the US, is born in the factory and requires for its exercise only a minute quantity of professional, political, and ideological intermediaries. Later scholars would sort of continue this line of thinking, analyzing the United States and the process of generating the consent and acquiescence, we might say, of the workforce here. Notably, one such scholar was Michael Burroy, labor and institutional researcher, who finds that in his own ethnographic work within US workplaces, that workplace regimes here, and perhaps also elsewhere, through which he explores through later comparative work, elicit consent at the point of production, so on the ground, in the factory setting, through things like work games, the gamification of work, through a series of minor or sometimes less minor concessions, quality of life improvements, other tasks and strategies and tactics, both rhetorical and practical, that effectively help him answer the question of not only why do American workers work, but why do they seem to work so dang hard? So advancing this line of thinking from Gramsci, Burroy wants us to better understand essentially how these special conditions in the US actually play out, in workplaces in particular. Now, despite the fact that many of Gramsci's ideas were developed while he was himself in prison, it remains the case that, at least in the United States, his line of thinking, his theoretical frameworks are infrequently applied to prison issues. There are, of course, some exceptions to that. One is that incarceration, and here mass incarceration or hyper-incarceration in particular, have come to be normalized outside of prisons. So some scholars have advanced notions of carceral hegemony to explain how the general public in the outside world, the governed, as it were, outside of prisons, seemingly accept incarceration and mass incarceration as a natural and appropriate expression of state power. Nevertheless, despite all of the issues that some of mine and also many other scholars across generations now have documented within US and other prisons, conditions of declining care and services, overcrowding, race and gender disparities in treatment, and many other lamentable realities of American prison life. It also remains, it seems to remain at least the case that folks inside prisons in the US relatively rarely engage in outright collective acts of rebellion. Scholars like Ashley Rubin have written about the ways that imprisoned folks in this context may engage in acts of friction, more minor pushbacks against the challenges of institutional contexts, but collective actual resistance to the institution itself remains relatively rare. And this has been a strain across prison research from at least the 1950s in the US through today. So one of the questions I want to try to consider is, if we're talking about the consent of the governed as something that is educated on the ground, on the factory floor, as it were, how is the consent of the governed, including the consent of the punished within penal institutions, actually generated? Or to sort of twist Michael Burroy's research question, why do people in prison, at least in the US, not resist more? So to do that, in the piece that I mentioned that I'm working on alongside Phil Goodman, we're advancing this sort of four-part typology or framework for understanding the generation of consent at various levels, both inside and outside the prison, which sort of culminate in let's say, a broader reaching form of carceral hegemony. And to do this, we're engaging in an act of theoretical reconstruction through a methodological technique that Michael Burroy himself advocates for. He calls it an interpretive revisit. So unlike a realist revisit, in his terms, in which the scholar might physically return to their field site to perhaps update their observations or follow up on lingering questions, an interpretive revisit may be oriented towards, among other things, reinterpreting existing data and reconstructing theory. So that's what I want to try to do today. Now, our typology focuses on sort of macro, meso, and micro levels, both outside and inside the prison. Because I'm focusing on the contributions that specifically come from my own book, it probably won't be surprising to you that I'm going to focus on the inside the prison bits specifically, which include at the sort of internal meso level, so internal to the prison, those who govern. I want to try to examine how prison operations and managerial strategies, if we want to call them that, are employed to both quell and preempt resistance from imprisoned populations, but also ensure acquiescence and obedience, and also productivity. Because importantly, in the US, these institutions remain sites of labor. A majority of people behind bars, approximately 2/3, still engage in labor as a facet of their incarceration. And so these are workplaces in addition to, other institutional agendas. And I also want to look a bit at, on the micro level, the governed, in this case, the punished, inside the prison. So how do those who are themselves subjected to punishment reproduce or maybe even embody institutional interests through practices and rhetorics and discourses? And how might they engage in acts of friction, but not open rebellion, that might actually reflect or reveal tacit consent to the realities of this institution, of the prison and of prison labor? Now, it's important to note that this does not suggest that the imprisoned willfully endure the pains of imprisonment or the pains of penal labor, but rather that, like other laborers under capitalism, they're subjected to the combined forces of ideology and coercion, and arguably even more coercion, overt coercion, than workers outside of prison. And so therefore, in many instances, they might have little other options in their day-to-day lives than to sort of give up this tacit consent. So we want to try to understand consent across these 4 levels. I'm going to focus on 2 of them today. So here's the book. It's called Orange Collar Labor. It came out in like the last week of 2022, the final week of December, from Oxford University Press. It was based on 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork within one medium security US prison. This took place across the years of 2015 and 2016. And the book emphasizes the structure and the experiences of labor behind bars. The theoretical frameworks in the book itself pull mostly from what we could think of as like cultural reproduction frameworks. I pull very heavily from insights from Pierre Bourdieu, take Bourdieu to prison, so to speak, and also labor process frameworks from scholars like Michael Gibson-Light and others to try to explain what's going on within this site. And over time, over the course of the fieldwork, I came to focus on 4 particular sites of labor within the institution. A sign shop where things like street signs were manufactured, a food factory where the meals for the entire institution were produced and packaged, a call center where imprisoned salesmen, this was a facility for men, where imprisoned salesmen made outbound, like cold call advertising agency sales, and a fleet auto garage where imprisoned mechanics repaired and maintained the vehicles used by correctional officers. And I supplement my observations within these sites and other sites across the facility with 82 in-depth interviews, mostly with imprisoned folks, also with a handful of staffers. But one of the first tasks in doing the fieldwork and then, of course, writing the book was to sort of distill down through the words and behaviors and the other things shared by my imprisoned participants primarily, what shapes how different jobs within these very diverse labor sites that are American prisons, what shapes how they're perceived. And so drawing from labor scholars like Arnie Kahlberg, I tried to understand basically what makes for a good prison job or a bad prison job in the eyes and through the language of those actually working them. And perhaps not surprisingly, much of it aligned with exactly what Kahlberg finds about outside workplaces. Things like pay, the level of complexity of the work, so how complex it might be in terms of the physical and mental labor involved, the level of autonomy, stability, the ability to move internally between different stations within the work site to sort of, among other things, just mix up your day or your month or your year or your decades in these sites. Some prison-specific features that made for a good prison job was the extent to which it might be somewhat buffered from the security apparatus of the prison. So certain sites, for instance, did not have or very rarely had badged correctional officers, COs, on site. Some of them didn't even have security cameras, which was personally a surprise to me when I first started the fieldwork. And these are also sites that my participants described as being as similar as one can get to a real-world work environment while still being within the institution. Conversely, the bad prison jobs effectively the inverse. The lowest pay, the work was very much de-skilled and was classified as unskilled by the institution. Very little autonomy or stability or mobility. Very openly and constantly exposed to security. So officers constantly on site, lots of cameras, lots of changes of the guard, as it were. And these were sites that were often described as prison within the prison. So this is essentially where I sort of start, and it's in this context of better understanding how these jobs are understood that I want to try to then understand what brings workers to consent to the realities of these workplaces. And so I began based on the sort of folk rankings, if we want to call them that. I don't know if I do actually, but based on the way that workers themselves sort of ranked jobs and described the jobs, I sort of mapped out this sort of internal labor pyramid. And I want to also point out that this is only a snapshot of all the jobs within this one particular prison. This is like almost a third of the jobs available, or I should say a third of all the work sites available. And within all these sites, numerous other jobs existed. The ones in red are the ones I spent the most time in: the sign shop, call center, fleet garage, and food factory. And this also highlights why I wound up focusing on those four, because they span this sort of pyramid with the two best jobs at the top, the very worst job, the food factory at the bottom, and the garage falling somewhere in between, met with some ambivalence depending on, the priorities and preferences of different incarcerated workers. Now, I show this because, well, one, it's sort of where the book starts, but also two, it kind of, I hope helps illustrate not only how hierarchical this system truly is in practice, and people talk about it as such on the ground, but also to highlight that this leads to a very competitive environment with folks grappling, struggling up sand piles, as it were, to try to attain these jobs at the top for the pay and the dignity and the numerous other perks or benefits that they might offer, and simultaneously trying to avoid being relegated to one of the positions at the bottom tier. And this is relevant to how consent to this overarching system is generated, as I'll get to in a moment. So what I want to do now for the next, hopefully 10 minutes or so, before we open it up for discussion, is essentially revisit some passages from the book with these new Gramscian themes in mind, to try to reinterpret some of what I initially observed and then later wrote. So starting from the top, from those who govern the institutional powers of the prison, one thing that I find and that we argue in the paper upon revisiting some of this field work through what's been previously written and published is that staffers in the prison, so correctional officers and other staff members within this site, definitely can wield direct coercion, and sometimes did very openly, but often did not. So similar to what other researchers have documented in free world workplaces outside of the prison, the managers frequently, in this case the managers being COs, would frequently flout official institutional or organizational regulations in order to elicit consent from the workers, and also to sort of assert the legitimacy of not only themselves as like quote unquote better overseers, but also the legitimacy of the institution itself as a place that's, as some staffers put it, harsh but fair. So here's one passage that I think helps capture this somewhat from the book. Overseers often facilitated friction to preclude acts of outright rebellion. If one CO did decide to reprimand someone for example, snacking on the job, which was a prohibited act, especially at food production sites, then the offending party and their compatriots often responded with new obstructions. This included soldiering or gold bricking or collective foot dragging to slow down production. In some instances, they outright sabotaged the labor process. When a newly hired manager started tenaciously checking prisoners for extra food before lunch one morning, the entire workforce seemed to grow agitated. Gloves and other tools and materials suddenly began to go missing that afternoon, slowing down work considerably. According to one longtime white shirt, those were the non-badged staffers who oversaw much of the food production process. According to one of them, these setbacks could have been avoided by allowing smaller insubordinations to persist. These guys, quote, they're used to certain things. When you take that away, like snacking, they're going to kick your ass. They're pissed, and they're going to rob us blind. They're going to sabotage us. They're going to throw things away. To avoid this, he said, he simply often looks the other way. So this practice of granting seemingly minor concessions of allowing someone to snack when they're hungry on the job, I argue helped keep open resistance at bay, while simultaneously reframing at least these staff members as more fair and more understanding, to sort of in an attempt to elicit not only efficiency and continued productivity, but also some degree of a rapport that would help that continue moving forward. Okay, speaking of moving forward, for the interest of time, I want to move to the next slide. So in addition to looking the other way, COs and other staffers often openly and consistently and emphatically emphasize the rehabilitative capacity of labor in general. And related to that, they openly would reward folks who they viewed as possessing work ethics or demonstrating a dedication to actually engage in work during their prison time, and also openly disparage those that they saw as lacking. And they would frequently do this in overtly racialized terms. For instance, as one CO would claim, I write in the book, so-called skilled workers exhibited dedication to learning, whereas others were presumed to be unskilled or unmotivated. I think some of these guys, one officer told me, they have more integrity. A place like the grounds crew, most of those guys don't want to work. That's one of those jobs at the bottom tier of the pyramid, by the way. They hide their rake under their bed and they go watch TV all day and you got to chase them down. They say, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I'll go to work now. And then they do the same thing tomorrow. Some people just, I hate to say it this way, they just come in here more ghetto. They want to go exploit the system to get over on somebody. But if you come in with no skills except pushing a rake, then that's what you do. Whereas these guys who hold skilled jobs, they grew up working. They like coming here and working. So not only does this very troubling quote capture or problematize the so-called rehabilitative capacity of work, because he's talking about how you do the job that you already are supposedly skilled at, which means it's not training people in any new skills, but he's also drawing on overtly racialized and racist language, such as referring to people as quote unquote more ghetto, and thereby willing and desiring to exploit the system. But this sort of discourse, it also serves, in addition to playing into prison racial politics, which I explore more in the book, it serves to encourage competition between these different sort of strata of workers, while also driving a wedge between groups of workers to encourage compliance and the pursuit of rewards, while further, let's say, weakening the collective power of this workforce to sort of collectively resist. Okay. Final slide from the top with regard to the institutional powers. Overseers in this institution, so officers and other staffers, also facilitate or encourage the very same sort of work games that Michael Burwoy documented in some of his fieldwork and outside work sites. And they do this similarly to elicit and reward productivity. There were lots of examples of this. This one's one of my favorite. One afternoon, the meat prep station overseer, the meat prep is where workers in the food factory literally just stood and all they did all day was roll bologna in plastic wrap and throw it into a tub. It was the most de-skilled work site that I think I encountered. The overseer of that station, Barba, stood at the end of a long steel table and attempted to goad Slick, one of the imprisoned workers, into a contest. Another worker, the heavy-set Latino man called Pun, was also known to be a particularly fast roller of meat when he wanted to be. Uh-oh, Barba said, somewhat mockingly to Slick, gesturing towards Pun. Your competition's picking up speed. Slick continued to roll, but shot a sideways glance toward Pun. He's feeling the pressure, another incarcerated man chimed in. Okay, fine, Slick conceded. Let's go, son. With a half grin, Pun accepted. Let's do this shit. Almost in sync, each man grabbed 2 pieces of bologna from the towers of sliced meat positioned between them, slapped them down, spun them up into sections of plastic wrap, and then began anew. The competitors shot furtive glances at each other's technique. The other rollers and I joined in as well, trying to keep pace with Slick and Pun, although most of us fell short. The race continued for nearly 10 minutes as Barba looked on, and it only stopped because it was count time within that work site. So this managerial practice openly encourages and rewards worker productivity, not only for the 2 men who were openly goaded into participating, but also all the other workers at the table, which at that moment included me. And that's part of the reason this is one of my favorite examples, because without even realizing it, I fell right into this trap and was just rolling up meat as fast as I could. to try to meet, the production goals of the work site. Okay, I want to move now towards the bottom part, the bottom right part of our four-part typology to talk about how those among the governed, the punished in this case, might embody and reflect some of these same outlooks and practices. So imprisoned workers may internalize institutional views and interests, reproducing dominant discourses and outlooks that they glean from overseers. For instance, those engaging in professionalization strategies, which is one of the techniques I talk about in the book that workers use to sort of get through their time and seek dignity at work, they reframe themselves as professionals in their respective fields, as the contemporaries of pro-craftsmen in outside sign shops or pro-salesmen in outside call centers. According to Javi, a call center worker, it feels like a real job, a professional atmosphere. You're representing your company. Jake revealed, another worker in the call center, the extent to which professionalization strategies shaped outlooks. When we're in here, despite wearing orange, we're working in a telemarketing place, and we are telemarketers in our mind. As such, men in these sites regarded the quality of their products or services as central to the company's success, and they would use that language openly. They in turn behaved as beneficiaries of efficiency and profit. In addition to the oft-muted praise of managers, usually a quick grunt or a mumbled, "That's good," these men sought to affirm self-worth and identity through embodying the roles of disciplined, dedicated workers. I'm going to let that one speak for itself. In addition to that, mirroring or parroting the discourses of many CEOs, many workers in turn came to prize and also to police work ethics, self-police, but also to police other imprisoned workers. Assertions to dedication to quality were constant, especially in the sign shop. New sign shop hires were closely trained in proper procedures and expectations by veteran workers. They were also quickly socialized into normative self-policing. Those who demonstrated work ethic, self-discipline, and dedication to the quality of the work were openly lauded by their coworkers. For instance, during a particularly slow day in the sign shop with no new orders coming in, one worker, Lemmy, used his spare time to practice his screen printing skills, which is one of the techniques they use to produce the street signs. Eli, a more veteran worker in the shop, walked over. He said, "This sort of stuff, the boss likes seeing this. He'll remember this when an important job comes through." You know what I mean? Later that same week, they would go on, they being many of the imprisoned workers in the site, to chastise another new worker who, when there was downtime, did not spend it this way. And they referred to him as unprofessional, as lacking a work ethic, which really revealed the sort of way that the very same, similar at least, if not exact same sort of language that officers and overseers would use to sort of classify workers as having integrity versus not, the workers themselves would also often embrace. They also initiated their own work games to similar results as those that were initiated by the staff. So in the sign shop, or excuse me, in the call center, Jake, who I referenced also in an earlier slide, was considered the inmate manager. This was an unofficial position that the overseers gave him. So as inmate manager, Jake was known to issue challenges or initiate sales contests to bolster morale and spur productivity. For instance, noticing that his coworker, called Taxi, had been having a slow sales day one afternoon, Jake challenged him to a race. "Yo, Taxi," he called across the floor, "you and me, sell off." Half turning in his chair, Taxi asked, "What, now?" "Yep," Jake replied, "I'm going for the title of best salesman ever, between you and me." Taxi chuckled and Jake continued. "Okay, how about the first one to make a sale, the other one does a pretty princess." This was a common bet that very much revealed many of the gender dynamics within the prison, where the loser of the bet would have to put their finger on top of their head and spin around like a ballerina, repeating the phrase, "I'm a pretty princess." There's a lot to be said there of masculinity behind bars, but that's maybe beyond today's scope. So, sealing the bet with a nod, the men turned back to their computer terminals and got to work. They each made repeated calls for some time. After nearly 2 tiring hours of persistence in the face of hang-ups and other failed calls, Taxi's arms finally shot into the air, victorious. Knowing immediately that he had lost, Jake leaned dramatically back in his seat and said, "Ah, no." With a shake of his head, he stood up and held his arms aloft to signal that he was preparing to make an announcement. "Hey, everyone, I'm a pretty princess." As the crew looked on, he spun around on one foot, raised his voice, and sang out, "I'm a pretty princess. Taxi's the best salesman ever." Men at nearby cubicles chuckled. Grinning, Jake took his seat and pointed to his opponent, saying, "Nice job, Taxi. You earned it." Okay, I'm at my time, so I want to conclude with some sort of closing thoughts by way of quick summary of some of what's going on here, in my view. So I hope what I've been able to at least begin to illustrate today is that there's sort of a combination of rhetorics and practices and institutional rules and informal norms and incentives that all work together to foster efficiency and compliance and tacit consent to the prison and to labor and to prison labor more specifically. Now, again, as I said at the top, overseers can and sometimes do deploy coercion, but they do so very selectively. But often in practice, day-to-day, subtler forms of control at an interactional level help to preempt broader forms of collective resistance, while also getting workers to continue to agree to basically keep going along with how the labor itself is structured and organized. And finally, just as precarity and insecurity outside of prisons help to facilitate acceptance of dominant ideologies, structural features inside provide the conditions for carceral hegemony. Now, these conditions include that hierarchical and competitive structure, and many staffers would openly talk about how the existence of a couple more desirable jobs at the top of the ladder, at the top of the pyramid, worked as an incentive for other workers to keep them working hard and also to keep them within the boundaries of institutional rules and regulations. Because among other things, one of the things that would preclude you from getting one of those jobs was having an institutional behavioral record that had tickets or infractions on it. So it was sort of part of the overarching system of control within the institution beyond just labor itself. I have more than I could say about that, but I want to leave us enough time for discussion and questions before people have to go to their Halloween parties or whatever y'all are getting up to tonight. So I'll conclude there. Thank you for your attention. Oh, this background image is the actual notebooks, some of the actual notebooks that Gramsci wrote in what later became the prison notebooks. Felt like a fitting end. Thank you very much.